Early this week, after the outbreak of war in the Middle East, the EU experienced its most serious shock to energy markets since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Oil and gas prices surged after the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of global oil supplies and a similar share of the world's liquefied natural gas, or LNG, trade passes, was effectively blocked. At the same time, Qatar, the world's third largest LNG exporter after the US and Australia, announced that LNG production would be halted at its main facility, one of the world's most important export sites. This is terrible news for the EU, which has become reliant on Qatar-EU LNG, and has spent the last few years grappling with high energy prices after it committed to weaning itself off cheap Russian gas. So in this video, we're going to take a closer look at the recent energy spike, and see how bad things could really get for Europe. We've heard a lot of talk about Europe de-risking or decoupling from the US recently. So in the latest issue of our magazine, we thought we'd discuss whether it's actually feasible, and why Europe could still struggle without US backing. That's just one of the 72 pages in the magazine, because as always, there's more to too long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Europe has become increasingly reliant on Qatar for LNG. For context, before 2022, Europe relied on Russia for roughly 50% of its natural gas, most of it delivered by pipeline. After the invasion, however, Europe moved quickly to curb that dependence, cutting Russian gas imports by roughly 2/3 within 3 years. By 2025, Russia accounted for just 12% of total EU gas imports, including both pipeline gas and liquefied natural gas. Now, despite years of efforts to accelerate the green transition, the shift away from fossil fuels has not happened as quickly or smoothly as Brussels hoped. Around 30% of EU households still rely on gas to heat their homes. So with fossil fuels remaining a central part of Europe's energy mix, and Russian pipeline gas set to be fully phased out by the end of 2027, the EU had to look elsewhere to fill the tanks. So the EU started importing LNG from a whole load of places, including the US, Algeria, Nigeria, and Qatar. In 2023, around 19% of all Qatari LNG cargoes went to Europe. While American LNG has come to account for a larger share of the EU's energy mix in the years since, Qatari LNG still remains a significant source, and its share of total imports is expected to grow in the coming years, both because European policymakers are anxious about depending too heavily on American exports, and because a number of big European energy companies, including Italy's Eni, the UK's Shell, and France's Total, have signed lucrative long-term contracts with the Gulf state. Despite occasional trade disputes, usually over environmental regulations, Europe has generally viewed Qatar as a reliable energy partner. This reflects Qatar's success in cultivating a soft power image as a diplomatic actor, and its knack for keeping geopolitics out of its energy trade. For example, during the 2017 to 2021 Gulf crisis, Qatar continued supplying gas to the United Arab Emirates via the Dolphin pipeline. In this sense, despite its precarious geopolitical position, Qatar was widely regarded as a safe and dependable energy trading partner. However, amidst the escalating war between the US, Israel, and Iran, this has all changed. Following the first airstrikes on the 28th of February, shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which is where Qatar's LNG travels through, began to slow down. Then on Monday, amid Iranian attacks on oil tankers, shipping at the choke point came to an effective halt, which sent energy prices across the world soaring. Brent crude futures, the international benchmark for global oil prices, climbed nearly 10% to a 13-month high of just over $80 a barrel. Then, in the wake of Iranian attacks on key energy infrastructure, Qatar's huge state-owned gas company, Qatar-Energy, which accounts for nearly 20% of global LNG trade, halted production of LNG. This saw European gas prices skyrocket. The benchmark gas prices traded on the Dutch TTF hub, the European benchmark for LNG, rose by 40% on Monday and nearly 50% on Tuesday. Adding to market anxiety is the fact that Europe is entering the end of winter with historically low gas storage levels. Over the past 2 years, the EU has struggled to keep its gas inventories filled and has become increasingly reliant on LNG imports, particularly ahead of winter. While Europe lost the bulk of its Russian pipeline supplies following Moscow's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, some remaining deliveries were curtailed again at the start of 2025, when a transit agreement with Kyiv expired. This year, the situation deteriorated further. Gas storage across the EU is currently below 40% capacity as the winter season draws to a close, below where it was this time last year. Germany and France, the bloc's two largest economies, are among the most exposed. Germany's storage facilities were just 20.5% full as of Saturday, while France's stood at 21%, according to data from Gas Infrastructure Europe. Now, the longer-term impact on energy prices will depend on how long hostilities last, and their impact on shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. According to Trump, the bombardment of Iran will continue for the next 4 to 5 weeks. But if Iran were to formally close the Strait of Hormuz, even for just a month, some estimates suggest that European gas prices could rise by 130%, a threshold that triggered the EU's 2022 energy crisis following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Of course, this will be terrible news for Europe. A sharp rise in oil and gas prices could trigger an inflation surge across European countries, which have already been battling inflation, sluggish growth, and low productivity, and force central banks across the continent to reverse their recent rate cuts. It's also a well-established fact in economics that recurrent bouts of inflation generally lead to persistently higher inflation in the long term, because they lead to higher so-called inflation expectations. To make matters worse, higher energy prices will work to further embolden Russian President Vladimir Putin as Russia enters the 5th year of its war in Ukraine. For context, in the last year, Russia has been struggling to reap in profits from its energy industry. However, this new oil price spike could give Russia the fiscal boost it needs, especially given that disruption in the Strait of Hormuz will mean more demand for Russian energy from oil importers like India and China. Finally, this could deepen Europe's newfound energy dependence on the US. America's share of European LNG imports has already risen from about 10% in 2021 to 57% in 2025, and could rise to 80% by 2030. This situation is already far from ideal for the EU, given Trump's confrontational nature towards European leaders and Europe's anxieties about energy independence. And it could be drastically exacerbated if Middle Eastern energy markets do break down. As we mentioned earlier, the latest issue of our magazine, Too Long, is out very soon. And if you subscribe using code SPRING26, then you can get your first copy for as little as $4.99, as well as 20% off every future copy, as long as you stay subscribed. This latest issue features our ranking of the world's 25 most influential people, using ratings from you, our audience, as well as our journalists. Inside, we reveal not only the full ranking, but also the stories of a number of people who made the list. From the return of Donald Trump and the calculated moves of Xi Jinping, to the AI frontiers of Sam Altman. We also look at the new entries, New York's first Muslim mayor Zohran Mamdani, the radical shift of Pope Leo XIV, and bastion of technocracy Mark Carney, as well as the shadows that still linger, like Jeffrey Epstein. Across 72 pages, this issue of Too Long features a whole lot more than just that though. We also have our whole cover story dedicated to how the UK became more divided than ever, and how a broken country can rebuild, as well as the fragmentation that's emerged within the EU, and how religion is being hijacked by politicians. Pre-order your copy at toolong.news, and remember to use code SPRING26 for our best ever price.